When upon the hill of heaven and earth on spawned the Anuna gods, since he neither spawned nor created grain with them, and since in the land he neither fashioned the yarn of Utu, the goddess of weaving, nor pegged out the loom for Utu, with no sheep appearing, there was no numerous lambs, and with no goats, there were no numerous kids. The sheep did not give birth to her twin lambs, and the goat did not give birth to her triplet kids. The Anuna, the great gods, do not even know the names of Izinakusu, grain, or sheep. Debate between sheep and grain. Welcome to Warfare, Advancement, and Revisionism. My name is Preston Floyd, and as always, I'm your host. I'd like to thank you all for listening. I hope you enjoyed last week's episode, and I hope you enjoy this week's. I've been very pleased with the last couple of weeks. Seems like growth from December, while not 100% carried over, is still trending pretty well upward over the course of the podcast of the year. So again, I'd like to thank everyone who has been continually listening, turning in, telling friends, sharing, all that kind of good stuff. I hope you'll continue to do all of that. Now this week we're going to be continuing to study Gobekli Tepe, and we'll expand on how and what we learned from the site and how that evolved after the initial discovery and excavation, as well as talk about how some of this has been changed or reinterpreted or challenged as the excavation and study of the site has continued over time. First though, we're going to break down the site following the way the excavation team has. The oldest evidence of occupation dates to around 9500 BCE, and the level of habitation and use of the site from those earliest dates didn't turn up much of anything, aside from being a place where tools were made. No hearth fires, buildings, things like that. As time went on, though, more distinct and more unique features were either developed or imported by the groups that used the site. Now, layer 1 of the site is the uppermost layer closest to the topsoil. This was the longest, used, and shows nothing but loose soil and dirt associated with what you would imagine with agriculture and animal herding. And the standard steady passage of time that you would see on a place or a landscape exposed to the elements. Now, when we discuss what has been uncovered at the site after that, we have two primary layers that have currently been excavated, or mostly excavated, and are being studied. The oldest layer is layer 3, and it has been dated to between 8,300 to about 7,500 BCE. And layer 2 has been dated to around 7,500 to about 6,000 BC. Now layer 3 is where you find most of the T-shaped pillars. The pillars of layer 3 are made of limestone. As far as I could tell, they're all made of limestone. And they're housed in 4 circular buildings. Now circular buildings seem to be kind of the universal shape of all homes or tents made of stone, mud brick, wood, pelts, or whatever else people have been using up to and during this PP&A period. These buildings, though, are stone, and they have been labeled as A, B, C, and D. Now, there has also been evidence that these buildings and some of the T-shaped pillars themselves had possibly been buried and then dug back up, maybe every few decades or so, on a decade-by-decade basis during the time frame that this site was in use. And there's no way to tell if they were all buried at once, if they were all kind of buried at different points, or maybe one was buried and 3 others were undone, or 2 and 2, however you want to break it up. And this is there's evidence of this practice at the neighboring Stone Hills site, which I believe I mentioned last week. In addition to Gobekli Tepe, there are a number of similar sites with T-shaped pillars in and around this region, and I'll go more into these sites later when we kind of discuss this in the next episode or so. Now, this led to a question of whether or not these were all built during the same general period of time by the same people, or if they were built one after another by separate groups. Klaus Schmidt, the gentleman who led the first in-depth archaeological dig on the region and there at the site, initially believed that this was a kind of a mountaintop retreat for various groups of hunter-gatherers to congregate seasonally and share, communally cooked meals, probably in the same time frame or in sync with the seasons that there was a mass migration of red deer through the area, using this place as kind of a camp initially in those early phases to kind of set up to hunt the deer that were moving through the region, but then later it came to kind of a melting pot or an area for different groups, possibly all related, possibly partially related, partially not even related at all, depending on the time frame. All of these are possible. We have no evidence one way or the other to just to conclusively say one way or the other, but this might have been a place for to come together to prepare a meal, settle disputes, make agreements, trades, arrange marriages, or even practice shared religious customs. Schmidt studied all of the figures on the T-shaped pillars and noticed that none of the animals are in the process of being hunted or attacked, and there are no deers on any of the pillars, at least in the ones in this main chamber as far as I know. They're merely looking on and might kind of be facing, or said to be facing, this is kind of relief work, so it's not 100% clear, but they may have been staring kind of into the center of these buildings that these pillars are kind of circled around. So this led Schmidt to theorize that these people were more interested in animistic or shamanistic practices, focusing on the spirits of humans and dead ancestors and animals, rather than fully articulated and anthropomorphized deities. He felt that the animals were guarding over the spirits of the dead, and there are a lot of fierce animals in this: boars, foxes, ducks, scorpions, things that you might think twice about attacking, though. Things like vultures, though there are some animals that you might not consider too fierce, things like ducks. Perhaps I read one theory that said perhaps these were different groups, that these animals were meant to represent different family groups that may come and kind of commune together. Possibly that might be why some pillars were buried. Some of these groups disappeared. They were no longer at the site, or they would come back later for different periods of time. So their pillars were unearthed and returned. These are all very interesting theories. I think they're pretty good. But Schmidt felt that the animals were guarding over the spirits of the dead, and he predicted that human remains had been deposited behind niches or alcoves that were covered up or even guarded by the pillars. Now, eventually, fragments of human skulls were found in 2017, but this was 3 years after Schmidt had passed, so whether or not this changed heavily how he interpreted or would have interpreted this, unfortunately, we do not know for sure. This could, of course, being in the PP&A period, at least for most of the earliest part, they could have been burying ancestors' remains, similar to how they were doing at houses at other sites. If this was, sometime later, and this has been associated with the site, this may have even been one of the starting locations for those skull cults or potential skull cults, where an individual's head was covered by plaster or whatever, and decorated to appear as the individual may have appeared in life. As far as I know, they haven't been able to get DNA from any of these sources so far, but it is something that is still being, of course, studied and excavated. Pardon for that rough cut there. There was an alarm. Yes, so there's been no DNA evidence discovered, but it's something I'm sure they'll continue to look for. So that was kind of Schmidt's idea based on what they found. So this led to a number of large questions, and just some stunning revelations if all this was true. First of all, this site was constructed solely by hunter-gatherers who had not done any type of monolithic carving, these large stone things, at least at this level. This is something well beyond what had been attempted before, at least as far as we have a record of, at least by hunter-gatherers. There are, of course, things that have probably precursed this in other places, things like the standing of stones together to create dolmens, things like that. There have been carved wood sources that are older than this, and they can be quite large. I think there have been some found in Siberia, though some of these stone pillars are massive. These are very large, much larger than your average human, though there are some that are considerably smaller and some on the size of humans. So this is something that is kind of a jump forward from what you would expect a hunter-gatherer would be able to do, and especially something that's only done seasonally. This is something that would take time and resources, and as we discussed last week, there is no readily available source of water, at least apparently, and there is no evidence for any kind of domestic sources of crops or animals. This is all something that's been done by people who conceivably were tracking and following the seasonal migrations of deer mostly. So these people creating this site seems, quite frankly, it breaks an understanding, or a long-held understanding, of human history, which this type of thing was only done by sedentary societies that had been in place for a while, and that they were supported in these kind of extra curricular, I guess is the best word, but by a non-mobile food source. So these heavy artistic and ceremonial outpourings are typically only done by people who have a reasonably steady and secure source of food. So this being done by a group of hunter-gatherers is extremely surprising, and it was a shock to the archaeological community at large, and this has of course led to the site becoming famous, and this is the interpretation that has kind of permeated most of the conversation about this site. It has also led to a numerous, shall we say, fringe archaeologists and historians and others that have kind of run with this idea that this site was, possibly a kind of dispersal place for a number of, shall we say, extraterrestrial or supernatural or preternatural humans more advanced, perhaps disseminating technology to the hunter-gatherers that were coming into the area. The quote I used at the start of this episode is from the beginning of the debate between sheep and grain, which is part of the Sumerian creation story, or one of the Sumerian creation stories, where it talks about how the gods come down from their mountain home to give humans these new creations they've made, sheep and grain. And to be fair, this isn't kind of a link that has just been made by the French. There are some historians, and I think Klaus Schmidt even did it to an extent, where these people may have been at the forefront of developing or adopting these new versions, or these new sources of food and animals. And they may have kind of dispersed it down when they left Gobekli Tepe, and kind of served as the origin point in the far myths. Excuse me, sorry. Someone's revving their engine just right at the stoplight out there. So that this may have been the very ancient myths at the starting point of some of these myths that, of course, over time have been built up, and that these wise people eventually became these ancient, primordial deities that, led to humanity living as they did. And I think there might be a little bit of truth to that. Now, obviously, this is the, this source is written down, I believe. I want to say that this version of the myth is from around, I think, the 3rd millennium BC, which would be, I believe it would be 10,000 years, give or take, from this time frame. I think I'm screwing up the timeline there, but it's quite a way. It's quite a while. Hold on, let me double check my math on that. So we'll be generous and say that maybe the site is underdated. Let's say it's 9,000 BC. This would probably be around 9,000 BC would be 11,000 years ago. And then this was written down probably, around 5,000 years, 4,000 or 5,000 years after the fact. Maybe a little bit more, maybe a little bit less. I'd have to, again, I need to double check that date. But basically, there's a long time. And without a written language, stories are easily able to be embellished if you don't hold them in place to an extent, or keep contextualizing them in the bounds of the realistic. They're more likely to become more fantastical, to make them more interesting, and to kind of help them stick in one's memory. I think that's a common part of storytelling. So, it's not hard to see that, maybe these people living up in the mountains did develop some technologies, and then when the climate changed or what have you, caused these people to kind of, have to abandon this site, at least more frequently. Maybe they passed on their information and their knowledge to their neighbors that these places they were moving back into. Maybe that drew more people in. Maybe this kind of became a place where the secrets of animal husbandry and agriculture were dispersed to other groups. And then this journey kind of became the kind of focal point for a lot of myths. It's possible. And there are parts of it I think could be true very easily. Now, whether or not these people that had built this place used psychic powers and, imparted these visions with some type of, visions or, forced mass hallucinations, things like that. Obviously, that is closer to the realm of science fiction, and they're rather than fact. And then, of course, there's no evidence to actually disprove or prove this, conveniently enough for some people who might peddle this type of thing. And this is much the same case for the people who say it was aliens. You just have to kind of take some of these theories at face value, and then there are some that obviously can never be proven or disproven, but who, that do make a very good story, if nothing else. Now, of course, I told you all that to kind of tell you that a lot of what was thought about Gobekli Tepe is no longer 100% accurate. I mentioned before that there was very little evidence of domesticated animals and foods and grains, and that was true for layer 3, this early layer that we're discussing. However, more advanced archaeological techniques, something called wet sieving has been important, has turned up some early or early sources of domesticated or semi-domesticated grains. There's still not much in the way of animal bones, but there is more and more evidence that these people were not just simple hunter-gatherers, that they probably were on the cutting edge of adopting agriculture and animal husbandry or animal handling. So that is something that has really come about recently, within the last, I want to say, 5 years or so, give or take. And there have been attempts to try and date some of these central structures in layer 3, just to kind of see if they have all been made at the same time or if they've been made by different groups. From what I understand, these they basically put them into a computer and they did some kind of weird algorithmic mapping. I did not understand at all how they came up with it. It involves derivation from mean and all this other very technical mathematic based stuff, and I did not for the life of me understand how they were able to kind of map this stuff the way they did. But that being said, the conclusion that they reached is that 3 of the sites were kind of in this triangle. It's almost a perfect almost perfect, like well, not an isosceles, but just there are 3 sites very close together that make a very simple triangle that are about equal. I think they were about I think it was 19 meters apart, give or take. Not perfect. There was 1 or 2 that were like a couple of feet away, but essentially they said that 3 of the sites were, yes, they were probably built at the exact same period, and that the 4th one, I think, which was C, was revealed to have been possibly a later addition. So oddly enough, I think A, B, and D are kind of the 3 that were built at the same time, and that C was a later addition. Now, of course, since then, they've done a little bit more excavation. They have found some other sites that are close to this kind of ritual complex that maybe could be dated to that period. Maybe it could be later, or it's possibly a kind of transitional thing that used older architecture and kind of merged with newer ones. The site was in use pretty regularly and constantly, actually. And I'll go into some other things that they've discovered. But essentially, what the people who did the study determined was that there was no evidence showing that these were built at different times. At least 3 of them. I know that some people pushed back on that and they said, well, no, they have to have been built at different times, but those people, as far as I know, have never actually been to the site and never actually studied it in person. So I'll take the people who use the computer algorithm and who have been working there for years. I'll take their word over people who are, really good. There are some really good archaeologists that say that it can't have been done all at the same time. I forget her name. It was an Israeli archaeologist. I'll have to look it up here in a moment. But she was one of the ones that said, it couldn't have all been done at the same time. Anna Belford Cohen. She's an Ukrainian-Israeli archaeologist. She thought it was more likely that there were a lot of different groups that considered this whole mountain range sacred, and they erected enclosures as needed on a case-by-case basis. And she thought that was way more likely than just one group showing up, going crazy, and then working on these constructions day and night. And she's right to an extent, because there have been issues, and we've talked about it. There's no regular source of water, correct? Well, there have been some developments on that end, again, recently, within the last few years. They have discovered that a cistern had been built on the site, and that this was used to collect rainwater. And this was something that was in use constantly while people were not at the site. They kind of had it operating to collect rainwater, and then when they would return, whether seasonally or every couple of years, whatever the case may be, they would have a reasonable amount of water for drinking or for using for other purposes. So this is something that has been fairly new. I don't know if they've been able to date the cistern, but it appears to be kind of in that middle layer between layer 3 and 2. So it may have been a transitional item that got expanded on as time went by. It may have been built after layer 3 during that layer 2 period. It's hard to say. I wasn't able to find firm answers one way or the other. So a lot of these early assumptions about this being a completely mobile hunter-gatherer group have turned out to be not necessarily false, but there is evidence showing that was not 100% correct. It's possible that there could have been people living here full time. In layer 2, you see a lot more buildings that show evidence that they're permanently habitated. And these are all square, which is something you see in the PP&B period. So it's possible that the square buildings were, built over the replacement or the torn down buildings from that would date to layer 3 that might be circular. It's possible they could have been, reuse different material from those smaller round buildings to build their new square ones. You also see them beginning to practice burning limestone to kind of create a kind of white flooring almost. This is something you see in the housing area. It's not, as far as I know, apparent in the temple, I guess, if you want to call it that. The more I guess spiritual animal complexes where that house these T-pillars. So they're experimenting with terrazzo, which is eventually would probably lead, once they learn how to master terrazzo, they might think, well, hey, this is what happens when we burn limestone. What happens if we burn these other types of stone? That probably leads to clay being burned, and that, of course, will help develop pottery. So we're in kind of an early period, and you're seeing these types of experimentation. Whatever the case, Gobekli Tepe is something that is still, again, being excavated. There's a lot of stuff that we don't know, and there is a ton of work still to be done here. I don't know if it will be completed in my lifetime. And I'm not the oldest man in the world. I'm mid to late 40s, or mid to late 30s, but there's still a lot here. And I do plan on continuing to kind of update on this site, as long as I can, keep doing the show. But I would recommend that you go to, there is a site on, there's a number of different platforms that you can find it on, including Instagram and I believe YouTube as well. And it is, it is called the Archéologie Soiliciere. That's ARKEOLOGJI, and then SOYLESILERI. And this is a site that it's Turkish, as you might be able to tell from the spelling. And they have both a YouTube page, Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, where basically they provide fairly regular updates and talks about things they're working on at the Stonehills or Tas Templar sites. And this is run by, forgive me, I'm going to butcher the gentleman's name again. He was the Turkish head of I believe the University of Istanbul, that he's kind of taken over the lead of the site since Klaus Schmidt's death. His name is hold on, sorry, I'm going back to last week's notes. I forgot to carry it over here. It is Nekmi Karul, and I'm sure, again, I'm butchering that. He's kind of the overall head of the site. He manages everyone. And then the other gentleman that is over, I guess, the German portion is actually a man by the name of Lee Clare. While Nekmi took over the entire site from Klaus Schmidt, Lee Clare took over the German section. And Lee is actually I believe he's either British or Australian. But he does work at the German institute that Klaus Schmidt worked with. But they offer fairly regular updates on the site and the location, and the kind of sister sites as well. And they offer, again, regular updates. Most of them are in Turkish, though Lee will occasionally do his own kind of briefing, and he'll kind of discuss some of the things as well in English for those that are interested or who cannot speak Turkish, but who do speak English. The most recent one of these they did, I believe, was back in November of last year, and that's actually part of the kind of the new stuff I've been kind of citing here. So this is all new. This is some stuff that, again, it's challenging kind of the standard, or at least the traditional depiction of Gobekli Tepe. It's rapidly being altered, which is sort of a problem, at least in the round, because part of the reason Gobekli Tepe is on the UNESCO World Heritage Site is because it is seen and was initially depicted as this great Stone Age monolith developed by hunter-gatherers, that this is kind of a turning point in human history, that this is perhaps the last spiritual evidence of hunter-gatherers, that this was a once kind of the last gasp of the hunter-gatherers as they're getting ready to be phased out by the coming agricultural revolution, if you want to call it that. And there are people who think it shouldn't be called that. I'm starting to buy into some of what they're selling. But this idea that this is this kind of seasonal, once every so often site that isn't in permanent use, and that this is a truly special and holy place, that it was just for kind of this sacred retreat, there's more and more evidence that shows that no, this may have been something like Jericho, where people are living. Maybe not all the people in this group. There may be people that are out hunting seasonally and they come back and they take shifts almost, and that they return and kind of touch base with their extended families and go back out into the wild, and that they continue to occupy this site. That's why you see so much backfilling. They're continuing to work. They're continuing to build on this. So this may not be this kind of last gasp of hunter-gatherer spirituality, but this may be something that's kind of a transitional point between that lifestyle and what will be the sedentary lifestyle. But who knows for sure? Again, this is all just speculation. Maybe we'll find out that this is all buried on an even older site much later, as excavations continue to happen. Maybe it will show that the hunter-gatherers here were kind of pinned in by the agriculturalists, and they were eventually killed off. Maybe that's why everything was buried. They didn't trust these stone carvings that these people had made. Or maybe hunter-gatherers just moved in after some early agriculturalists were like, hey, we're not getting enough rain here, we need to leave. There are several options. I think it could be, but thankfully this site again is continuing to be updated, and if there are any major things coming forward or going forward, I'll certainly try to cover them on an episode or two. But yeah, so that's kind of what people thought Gobekli Tepe was initially. And I know I've kind of been like almost bad-mouthing it here at the end. No, I'm not trying to do that. I'm trying to show that, it's not... it is still very unique and it's still very important. And again, this could kind of be an origin source for certain parts of later myths. But it could also be just a failed experiment, and these people, they was like, okay, this place didn't work out. Let's try this somewhere else. And it's very possible they did. Or it's possible that, there are more of these sites outside of the Stone Hills that might be nearby, perhaps in the Levant, or in northern Mesopotamia, or maybe further north in other parts of Turkey. We will be going a little bit to the west in our next set of episodes to talk about Karahoyuk, which is another site that's very unique. But I think for now, this is probably a good place to kind of call this one. I actually recorded a special episode with a guest a little bit earlier today. That was almost an hour and a half there. So I've got some editing to do. That one won't be out for a little while longer. There's a couple more kind of general areas I want to talk about in this region, and then I'm going to start moving into some other places, and then I'll kind of go into we got to those secondary domestication episodes and agricultural developments and developments of cities and that kind of thing, and some of the institutions or proto-institutions that may have been involved in that type of structure developing. So it may be a little bit before that one comes out. I may do those piecemeal as well and just release them like in the middle of standard episodes. I'm not 100% sure on that yet, but I hope you all look forward to it And I hope you've enjoyed this week's episode. I will continue with Gobekli Tepe again next week. And then I'll also bring in some of these sister sites I've been talking about. Karahan Tepe, Sefer Tepe, and a few others. And just talking about how they compare in terms of time frame, size, that sort of thing. And some of these sites may even be older than Gobekli Tepe. That this is actually maybe the reason Gobekli Tepe is so important is because it was found first, but it may not be the oldest, as we'll see. It may have been better suited to building these stone structures and pillars. But again, all that's for next week. There may be 2 or so episodes like that, but after that we'll continue to Catalhoyuk. So if you have any questions or feedback or constructive criticism, please reach out to me at waradrevpod@gmail.com, or you can reach me via direct message on Twitter as well. So I hope you've enjoyed this episode. I hope you will continue to like and listen and all that good stuff. And I hope you have a good rest of your day. Thank you. Goodbye.